Wyoming Territory, October 1879. The fire had already taken the barn when Margaret Zeller threw open the cabin door and screamed for her son. "Peter! Get your sister!" Smoke curled through the rafters behind her, thick and choking. The livestock had bolted, the horses were gone, and the sound of men shouting outside meant one thing: this was no accident. Margaret ran toward the flames barefoot, nightgown whipping in the wind, just as Peter came stumbling from the back with a coughing 5-year-old Phoebe in his arms. "I got her!" he cried, eyes wide. "Run!" Margaret shouted, voice cracking as she turned, shielding their escape with her body. A shadow moved behind them, then another. Gunshots cracked through the air. One whizzed past Margaret's head and buried itself in the porch post. They ran for the trees. No time to grab anything. No warm clothes. No food. Just the three of them, bare-legged and breathless, vanishing into the dark pines as the Zeller ranch, the place Margaret and her late husband had built with their own hands, burned behind them. They hid until sunrise. Peter pressed close to her side, Phoebe curled in her lap, shivering. Margaret kept her ears sharp and her arms tighter. "I saw their faces," Peter whispered. "So did I," Margaret said. "But we are not going back." By noon the next day, they were walking east along a narrow trail that wound through foothills and brush. Margaret's feet bled. Phoebe cried. The sun cooked overhead. Her mind raced with what came next. She had no kin nearby. The Zellers had settled out here on a promise of land and solitude, not support. When Phoebe collapsed from exhaustion, Margaret lifted her and kept walking. Peter trailed behind, silent now, his jaw tight like his father's had been. By dusk, they stumbled into a stretch of trees where the wind had died and the stream ran slow and clean. Margaret knelt to drink. That was when she saw him. He stood across the stream, tall and still, wrapped in a soft brown hide and watching her with dark, steady eyes. His hair was long, braided with red cloth, and his face held no threat, only caution. Peter reached for a rock. "No," Margaret said quickly, standing. She adjusted Phoebe in her arms and faced the stranger. "We are not here to fight." The man stepped forward. "You are running." His voice was quiet, low, and certain. Margaret nodded once. "They burned our home," she said. "Took everything. I have no one else." The man looked at her children, the way Phoebe clung to her mother's shoulder, the way Peter stood in front of them both. He crossed the water. "My name is Veketa," he said. "Come. You will not be turned away tonight." Margaret stared at him, unsure if she had truly heard kindness or if exhaustion made her believe it. But then Veketa turned and began walking, not looking back. Something in her chest gave way. She followed. His camp was tucked deep in a fold of the hills, where flat rock met pine and a small fire burned in a stone circle. He had a lean-to built with care, and a woven blanket he handed to Phoebe without a word. Margaret crouched beside the fire, her dress torn, her hands raw. "Why are you helping us?" Veketa sat across from her. "Because you have lost everything," he said simply. "And because your heart is still fighting." Later, as the children slept, she watched him sharpen a blade by the firelight. His movements were calm, deliberate. A man used to solitude but not hardness. "I do not know how to thank you," she said. "You do not need to," he replied. The silence stretched between them, but it did not feel cold. Over the next days, Veketa showed them where to gather food, how to set traps. He spoke little, but when he did, it mattered. Peter followed him like a stray dog one moment, and a student the next. Phoebe clung to Margaret, but slowly began whispering stories to Veketa when she thought no one listened. They stayed longer than Margaret planned because walking away meant walking into nothing. The world behind them had turned to ash, and the road ahead held no promise. One night, as frost kissed the edges of the leaves, Margaret sat beside Veketa, their legs nearly touching. "I was not strong enough to stop them," she said quietly. "I could not protect what we built." Veketa looked at her, the firelight flickering in his eyes. You did protect it, he said. You protected the only part that mattered. Margaret turned to him, tears rising fast. I do not know what to do now. You rest, he said. You stay warm. You teach your son how to survive. You let your daughter laugh again. And after that? Then, he said, you begin again. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not just a man who offered kindness, but one who carried his own scars quietly. She saw strength that did not demand, and warmth that did not falter. You are alone too, she said. Veketa stared into the fire. I was. Their hands brushed. She did not pull away. Neither did he. That night, Margaret lay awake, heart beating slow and steady in the darkness. For the first time since her husband died, she felt something stir, something that was not grief or fear. Hope. Veketa had given them shelter. But something deeper had already begun to take root. A quiet bond. A new beginning. Fate, she thought, folding her hand over her chest where it ached with something almost like peace. Maybe this was not the end of her story. Maybe it was the start of something far better. The snow came early that year. It began as a fine dust settling into the pine needles, the kind that vanished when touched. Then, one morning, Margaret woke to find the world outside draped in silence, white and thick, the trees bowed and the lean to heavy with it. Veketa had risen before her, already sweeping a path clear to the stream with a pine branch, his footprints the only marks on the earth. Peter stood just behind him, mimicking his movements with a smaller branch. Margaret watched from the doorway, Phoebe still asleep against her shoulder, her breath warm against Margaret's collarbone. She stepped outside only once. Veketa looked up and nodded. Peter turned. He says the elk move lower when it snows like this. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter. You going to track them? If he lets me, Peter said, his eyes flicking to Veketa. Veketa considered him a moment, then handed him a carved length of wood. You carry this, he said. You do not shoot unless I say. Peter's mouth opened in protest, but Veketa's look silenced it. He took the weapon and followed, his boots crunching over the frozen ground. Margaret watched them disappear between the trees. She didn't know when Peter had started walking like him, deliberate and quiet, or when he'd begun quoting Veketa's words back to her like scripture. Inside the shelter, she set Phoebe near the warm stones and began sorting the roots they'd gathered. Her hands moved without thought. It wasn't until she reached for the last bundle that she paused, realizing she hadn't thought of the ranch since the snowfall. She had thought the grief would consume everything, burn down her memories the way flames had taken the rest. But now it sat quiet, like a stone at the bottom of a river, still there, but no longer rising. The day passed slow. She mended Peter's shirt where the seam had come loose, humming low as Phoebe played with a string of dried berries. When the wind picked up, she stepped outside to gather kindling and saw them returning, Peter with a flushed face and flushed hands, Veketa behind him, dragging a young doe across the snow. Peter's voice carried. I saw her first. You stepped too loud, Veketa said. She was already looking at me. Margaret met them halfway. You'll clean that before you come near the fire. Peter nodded, his pride too big for words. Veketa met her eyes once, then lowered his gaze as he passed. Later, when the meat was roasting and the children asleep, she sat beside him, her knees drawn close under her shawl. He was carving something again, another length of wood thin to a point, the knife moving slow and sure. You were patient with him, she said. He wants to be older than he is. Margaret traced a line in the dirt with her finger. He took to you quick. Veketa didn't look up. He needed someone who listens more than they speak. She let that sit between them, the fire popping softly. You always live alone? There were others. A long time ago. Family? He paused in his carving. Not by blood. She waited, but he didn't offer more. Instead, he handed her the finished piece, a slender spindle of wood shaped into a small spoon. It fit in her palm like it had always belonged there. I've never had anything made for me, she said, her throat tightening. Veketa's voice was low. That's hard to believe. It's true, she said. My husband worked the land. He built our barn. But he never carved spoons. Maybe he showed care in other ways. He did, she said. He gave me 2 children. Veketa's gaze softened. And you kept them alive. I couldn't save the rest. You saved what mattered. They didn't speak after that. The silence returned, but it didn't feel empty. The next morning, Peter woke early to tend the fire. Margaret found Veketa preparing snares, his breath silver in the cold air. She stepped beside him, Phoebe still sleeping, and touched his arm lightly. You stay here, he said. I'll come back before dusk. She nodded. Be careful. He glanced at her hand where it rested against his sleeve. You too. That day, while he was gone, she worked. She scraped hides he'd left near the edge of the shelter, her fingers stiff with cold. She showed Peter how to twist cord from bark. She boiled marrow for Phoebe's aching cough. As dusk settled, Phoebe stirred and asked, Is he coming back? He said he would, Margaret answered. When he did, she was already waiting, a pot of stew simmering, a new layer of pine boughs added to the roof. He stepped into the glow of the firelight, snow in his hair, and handed her a wrapped bundle of roots and smoked meat. For tomorrow, he said. She took it. You always think ahead. Veketa met her eyes and said, I've always had to. That night, after the children were asleep, she didn't sit across from him. She sat beside him. Closer than before. He didn't move away. The fire crackled, and she leaned just slightly into the warmth of his shoulder. He looked down at her, then turned his face away not from shame, but to give her time. She stayed where she was. Outside, the snow fell gentle and unhurried. Inside, 2 people who had known too much loss found something that held. Not quickly. Not loudly. But surely. The cold deepened. Wind pressed against the trees and made the sky feel farther off, like it had pulled away to watch from a distance. Margaret lined the inside of the shelter with woven grass and bark she had gathered herself. Veketa had returned late the evening before with a gash above his brow and blood dried into his collar. He hadn't spoken of what happened, only nodded when she pressed a cloth to the wound and sat still as she cleaned it. That morning, she woke to find Peter gone, a small mark in the snow his only trace. Her breath caught, but Phoebe stirred before she could rise, so she wrapped the girl tighter in the quilt and stepped outside. Veketa stood near the ridge above the camp, watching the trail. Peter trudged up from below a moment later, hauling a bundle of deadfall in his arms. I thought it'd help, he said, cheeks flushed, eyes darting to his mother. Veketa looked to Margaret. He asked before he left. She nodded slowly. Next time you wake me first. Peter dropped the wood, nodded, and crouched beside the fire to stack it properly. Margaret walked to Veketa, her boots sinking into the crusted snow. You were bleeding when you came back. I met 2 men near the ridge. They were looking for something. Maybe someone. Did they follow you? No. But they were close. She folded her arms. You think they were part of it? I know they were. She didn't ask how. She didn't have to. Then we can't stay here. He looked at her a long time, eyes steady, then said, They'll pass through. Winter will keep them moving. And if they circle back? Then I'll stop them. Margaret exhaled, her breath a pale cloud. We don't want you hurt for our sake. Veketa turned toward the shelter, where Peter was coaxing the fire to life, and Phoebe's laugh rang out like a bell. You've already changed what I wake for. That night, Margaret sat beside him while he checked his bowstring. The fire was low, and the world outside the shelter held to its hush. She dipped a cloth in warm water and handed it to him without speaking. He took it, wiped the soot from his hands, then passed it back. You had a wife once, she said, not as a question. No. But there was someone I would have stayed for. What happened? She chose a life with her people. I had already chosen mine. Margaret ran her fingers along the edge of the blanket on her lap. Did you love her? He didn't answer right away. I respected her. I listened. But no, I did not love her. Margaret looked into the fire. I did love my husband. I know. She turned to him. Do you? I see it in how you carry grief. You don't let it speak for you, but it doesn't leave. She was quiet a long time. I don't want to forget him. You don't have to, he said. You only have to decide whether memory is a door or a wall. They didn't speak again that night, but when she stood to go inside and he rose beside her, their hands brushed and held. Brief but certain. In the days that followed, Margaret taught Phoebe how to twist cordage from dried grass. Veketa showed Peter how to track rabbits through the snow. The children learned quickly, and the air between the four of them grew lighter. Not joyful, not yet, but easier. One morning, while the frost still clung to the needles, Veketa returned from checking the traps with a small bundle tucked under his coat. Margaret stepped outside as he approached. What is it? He unwrapped the cloth and revealed an old iron kettle. Dented, blackened, but whole. I found it buried near a fire ring west of here, he said. Abandoned, maybe from the last travelers before the snow. She reached for it. We needed another pot. I know. That evening, she used it to boil the marrow bones he'd brought in. When the stew was done, she filled 2 bowls and passed one to him. I never thought I'd feel useful again, she said. You were never not useful. She smiled, faint but sure. You're the only man who's ever said that to me. He didn't answer, only met her eyes and held them. The next morning, she woke to find a pair of moccasins beside her bedroll. Soft, stitched with sinew hers. She touched the beadwork, then looked up to find Veketa already tending the fire. You made these? He nodded once. Your feet were bleeding again. She walked to him, moccasins in hand. Why do you do these things for me? He looked up at her. Because I want to. She stepped closer. I want to understand what that means. He stood slowly, the fire casting light up his cheek. It means I look for reasons to stay near you. She swallowed. Have you found enough? His voice was quiet. More than I ever expected. Margaret reached for his hand, her fingers closing around his. Then don't look further. He held her gaze, then leaned in, not fast, not certain, but open. She met him halfway, her lips brushing his, soft and slow. When she pulled back, there was no weight in her chest, only a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. From inside, Phoebe stirred and called for her. Margaret smiled. We should get breakfast. Veketa didn't let go of her hand. We will. They stepped back toward the shelter together. Side by side. Hand in hand. And this time, Margaret didn't look over her shoulder. The thaw came slow that spring, not in a rush, but in patches, ice melting down from the tree limbs first, then from the rocks, then finally from the ground itself. Water pooled in the low places, thick with pine needles and old frost. Margaret stepped carefully as she checked the traps Veketa had reset, her new moccasins quiet against the wet earth. Phoebe walked just ahead of her, holding a willow switch and tapping it against the trunks as she passed. Her cough had faded. She asked more questions now, about birds, about plants, about how long they would live in the hills. Margaret never gave her a fixed answer, only said, as long as it's safe. By the time they returned to the shelter, Peter was bent over a flat stone, using a splinter of bone to etch something into the surface. Veketa crouched near him, not correcting, only watching. Margaret stood for a moment, hidden from their sight, and studied them both. Peter's brow furrowed in concentration, Veketa still as a stone beside him. They hadn't spoken much that day, but they never had to. She saw it in how Peter sat closer to him now, how he waited before speaking to see if Veketa had more to say. She stepped forward then, her shadow crossing the stone. Veketa looked up first. Your hands are cold, he said. Margaret held them out. That stream's still half ice. Peter looked up. You think we'll plant anything this year? Depends what we can find, she said. We'll need seed, tools, a place where the soil's soft enough. Veketa stood. I know land east of here. The earth there's dark. Good for growing. She met his eyes. How far? 3 days' walk. Maybe 4, with the children. Peter straightened. We could build again. Veketa's voice stayed calm. If you're ready. Margaret looked at her son, then at the man beside him. We'll need shelter before next snowfall. Phoebe tugged at her sleeve. Will there be wildflowers? Margaret knelt beside her. If the land's right, yes. That night, after the fire had burned low, she lay beside Veketa beneath the pine frame of the lean-to. The children slept close, curled in furs. The stars were clear above, and the cold no longer bit as sharply. You could have sent us on our way, she said quietly. I thought about it, he answered. She turned her face toward him. Why didn't you? I saw what you carried. And I knew it would match what I'd been carrying too. She reached over and laid her palm against his chest. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. His breath deepened. I believe you. The next morning, they packed what little they had. Veketa lashed furs over a frame he dragged behind them, so Phoebe could ride when her legs tired. Peter carried a bundle of tools, 2 knives, a hatchet, and a length of cord Veketa had woven from rawhide. They moved slow. Margaret kept her eyes on the trees, alert for signs of return. But the hills stayed quiet, and by the second day, she let herself breathe easier. At dusk, they came across a burned-out wagon, its frame collapsed inward, its wheels long taken. Peter stepped toward it, but Veketa held out an arm. Wait! Margaret crouched beside a patch of disturbed earth near the axle. A set of boot prints, softened by time, led away toward the ridge. No others. Just one, she said. Veketa nodded. Not recent. Phoebe tugged at her hand. Was it someone like us? Margaret brushed a curl from her daughter's forehead. Maybe. They moved on. On the third night they made camp near a creek, where the mud was thick and the banks full of tracks deer, raccoon, something larger. Peter crouched beside them. Elk? Veketa knelt beside him. Cougar. Peter's eyes widened. That close? Gone now. But they follow water. That night, Margaret woke to find Veketa already sitting upright, bow across his lap. She sat beside him, wrapping her shawl tighter. You don't sleep much, she said. I listen, he replied. She leaned her head against his shoulder. You'll tell me if I need to worry. I will. They reached the land on the 4th day, just as the clouds broke and the sun warmed the backs of their necks. It lay in a shallow valley, ringed by trees, with the creek curling through one side and a gentle rise of soft earth on the far end. Peter ran ahead, dropping his bundle, arms out wide. It's big! Phoebe followed, laughing, her feet kicking up damp grass. Margaret stood at the edge and looked out. You were right. Veketa didn't speak. He only stood beside her, his silence a promise. They spent the next week building again. Not rushed, not desperate this time. Veketa shaped the frame while Margaret tied the lashings. Peter hauled stone for the hearth. Phoebe gathered branches and wild mint from the creek edge. Each night they ate together. Each morning, they rose with the sun and worked again. On the 7th day, the roof was finished. Margaret stood in the doorway, the children asleep on the floor behind her, and watched Veketa smooth the last length of bark along the ridge. He climbed down slow, and when he reached her, she stepped aside to let him in. He looked around. You built this. We built this, she said. He turned to her. This time, it'll hold. She reached for his hand. This time, we're not alone. When he bent his head and kissed her, it was not for comfort, or thanks, or forgiveness. It was for the life they had chosen to build together, with nothing borrowed and nothing owed. Margaret closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she felt the ground beneath her as something she could claim. Not a refuge. A home. By mid-April, the ground softened enough for planting. Margaret kneaded the earth with her palms, the soil damp and rich beneath her nails. She had cleared a patch in the valley's sunniest bend, where the creek veered away and left behind silted ground. Veketa stood nearby, sharpening the handle of a tool he'd carved from a broken fence post they'd found on the trail weeks past. Peter ran lengths of twine between two stakes, measuring rows with the quiet precision he'd picked up without being taught. Margaret glanced up. "Phoebe's still down by the water?" "She's picking stones," Veketa said. "Wants to line the edges." Margaret wiped her hands on her skirt. "She gets that from me." "She gets her steadiness from you," he said. "But her eyes are yours." Margaret stood and brushed the dirt off her knees. "You've been watching close." "I always do." She walked toward him, resting a hand on his arm lightly. "You see more than you say. I speak when I know it's needed." Peter looked over his shoulder. "I finished the rows." "Start with the beans," Margaret said. "Then the squash." Veketa handed her the tool. "You'll need this." The handle's strong now. She held it, testing the weight. "Feels right." He tilted his head. "You look at this land like it belongs to you." She met his eyes. "It does now." They planted until the light faded. That evening, Margaret sat on the cabin's newly hewn step, her back resting against the rough timber. Veketa stood at the edge of the yard, facing the tree, still as wood. She watched the way his shoulders lifted when the wind stirred the branches, the way he listened to things she couldn't hear. He turned after a while and walked to her. "You'll have deer in the garden by next moon. We'll fence it. I'll help." She pulled her shawl tighter. "You always do." He crouched beside her, resting one hand on the step. "I was thinking today. About? The names we carry." She waited. "I was raised with two tongues," he said. "My mother's and my father's. I've kept both in me. But I've never passed them on." She looked down at her hands. "You think it's time?" He nodded. "I want to teach them to Peter. And Phoebe if she wants." Margaret turned fully to face him. "Then teach me first." He held her gaze. "You'd want that? If we're building a life together, I want to know the words that shaped you." He reached out and took her hand in both of his. "Your name, in my mother's tongue, would mean the one who steadies." She closed her fingers around his. "What about yours?" "It means he who waits with fire." She smiled. "Then we were always meant to find each other." That night, they lay side by side under a roof they had raised, the walls still smelling of sap and fresh bark. Phoebe slept with her head on Margaret's arm, and Peter curled near the hearth, a folded blanket tucked under him. Veketa reached across the space and brushed Margaret's hair back from her face. "I never imagined this," he said. She whispered. "Neither did I. But I wouldn't trade it." He leaned in slowly, and she met him there, the kiss warm and deep and certain. When they drew apart, her eyes stayed closed a moment longer. "I love you," she said, voice low. Veketa's hand found hers. "And I love you." They rose before dawn the next morning, side by side at the stream, washing their hands in silence. Veketa taught her a new word with the sunrise, and she repeated it back, her mouth shaping the syllables carefully. He smiled not as a reaction, but as recognition. By early summer, the garden began to bloom. Squash leaves spread wide like open hands. Beans climbed the stakes Peter had driven into the soil. The fence held strong. Veketa tanned hides in the shade, the children helping him scrape and stretch them. Margaret made soap from lion ash, its scent sharp but clean. One afternoon, a rider passed by the edge of the woods. He did not stop, only tipped his hat when Veketa stepped into view. Margaret watched from the doorway, a rifle within reach, but the man rode on without slowing. The world had not forgotten them, but it no longer pressed close. By harvest, the cabin had a second room. Peter built shelves for dried meat and roots. Phoebe stitched a cloth for the windows, uneven but bright. They held a small feast when the beans came in, just the four of them, sitting cross-legged around a flat stone with corn cakes and stew. Margaret raised her cup. "To what we've made," Veketa added. "And what we'll keep." Peter grinned. "Does this mean we're staying?" Margaret looked at Veketa, then at her children. "It does." That night, with the fire low and the air warm from the day's sun, Margaret lay with her head on Veketa's chest, his arm around her. "I want to marry you," she said softly. He didn't answer right away. Then, "I was waiting for you to say it first." She lifted her head. "You knew I would?" He nodded once. "You always say the things that matter." "Then say yes." "I say yes." They married in the clearing near the creek. No preacher, no paper, just hands joined and vows spoken with the children as witness and birdsong in the branches overhead. Veketa placed a carved ring on her finger, made from the same wood as the spoon he'd once given her. Margaret tied a length of red ribbon around his wrist, the last piece from her wedding dress, worn thin but strong. Years passed, slow and full. The cabin grew, as did the children. Peter built his own shelter near the ridge and hunted with skill. Phoebe learned both tongues and taught them to her own children in time. Margaret and Veketa aged with the land, their days marked by harvests and thaw, by stories shared beside the hearth and long walks through the trees. Their love never dimmed, it deepened, quiet and constant, like the stream that first brought them together. And each night, before sleep, they held hands beneath the same roof they built in the hush of spring, in a valley that had been empty once, but would never be again.